Scope, what up? All right, you ready? Invite your friends, your followers. What up? What up, Matt? Matt, you stay ready, don't you? I'm turning this other light on. Give myself a little bit more light. Is that better? Hey, Doc, how you doing? I see you stay ready. Good. Well, I'm definitely ready for tonight's discussion. So, if you're joining us now, this is Evangelicals, Egyptology, and Why It Matters, part 2. I did part 1 yesterday and just started with the idea of what that means. We want to talk about faith, consciousness in a very conscious world. Good. Hey, how you doing? Who are you? Hey, Miss Rachel, how you doing? I'm glad it's the first time you're listening. So yesterday, very interesting. Wanted to be very relevant. If you could, this will be, I'm doing well. This will be a very, hopefully a rich time for you, hopefully even encouraging and inspiring for many of us. If you could invite your followers, people who would just be interested to hear about faith, consciousness, what that means 2015, what it means for all humankind, but also what that means specifically for Africans and African Americans, those who are wrestling through what consciousness looks like in this season, in this situation, in this setting. And so I'll give you about 20 more seconds to invite people to the chat. Hopefully it'll be very helpful. I've been working on notes. Hey, man, the explanation, knowledge versus love. Yeah, it's crazy. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm working a lot on those things. And just want to give you guys some good stuff on the scope. Don't want to waste your time because my time is definitely valuable. So I want to make sure if we're doing a scope that it's good for you. My name is BJ Thompson. I serve as the director of Build a Better Us. I am a husband. I've been married for 13 years to my beautiful wife, Vanja. I am a father of 3, 12, 8, and 6. But I am very concerned about just the state of good. I'll tweet a blog piece I wrote called Identity. Okay, good. Just the state of America, kind of where we are faith-wise. I mean, you've seen a lot of things with Syrian refugees. You've seen a lot of things with Islamophobia. You've seen a lot of things with just Black lives and just what that means. And I think that it's allowed us, it's caused us to go to a place in history and almost return back to what the civil rights kind of era and arena. And so I just want to talk about some things that have come up in it. And honestly, we are only revisiting what, many of our, hey, how you doing from Paris? We're only revisiting what many of our, fathers and mothers and many activists have already participated in. I mean, 64 and 69, in the 50s, and all sorts of things that have occurred that have created, ongoing dialogue, discussion about the state of America, what it means to be, an American citizen, along with what it means to be a Black citizen in American society. And so I want to talk about that tonight. Again, there is this theme, really how this came up. It came up for me a few years back. I remember I was in a barbershop and I was sitting there and a video came on, and it was a video that was basically dismantling all Christianity. And there's a video called The Zygote, and it was by, really fueled by a guy named Malachi Zoo York, who kind of basically is the face of a thing called Egyptology. And I just watched him dismantle Christianity right there in front of me in the barbershop. And so, it's big. It's the first time I ever heard of it. Hey, how you doing? It would. I don't know if the scope apply to you. It's all about faith, consciousness, evangelicalism, and Egyptology, which is basically 2 faith systems. One's based off of culture and history. One's based off of history and biblical theology. So I just want to talk to an audience of people right now. So if you're joining in, here's why I'm talking about this. We are spiritual beings, and we all have a desire to ascend to something higher. We want to be connected to the higher power. And there's things in our lives that cause us to either doubt, reconsider, go on a journey and search what that means. And sometimes, man, we end up on a journey that's good for us, that's healthy, despite the difficulties, despite the things that have occurred. Like we find ourselves in a good place where, man, this thing that was difficult end up being for our good, right? But then there's other times that things that are difficult come about. They begin to put to the test our very foundations of who we are. And we find ourselves in situations where we don't know what's left or what's right. And it begins to shake at the very foundation of who we are as a people, right? And so the reason why I'm doing this scope is for this reason. I believe that there is a central point where all humanity can meet, but we have to begin to be transparent, honest, historical, theological, logical, but also practical about the things that have occurred that kept us, hey, how you doing? That have kept us from doing those things, right? And so let me just talk to you a little bit about the state of Black consciousness, Black thought, right? Because, we have for a long time been told that, you are just kind of a part of a melting pot of people, which in some ways is true, is that, we are all human beings. We all come from the same creator, right? But in other ways, it's not true, that we have all been given different backgrounds, and there's different foods and different cultures. I remember I used to work in a state home, and they would make these beautiful meals. It would be steak, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread. And what they would do is, in order to feed certain people, they would take that meal and they would put it inside of a blender. And that blender would then take that cornbread, steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans, and it would turn it into this like green goo that you poured into a cup, and you just kind of like sipped and you drank the cup, right? And here's what happened. In the process of trying to feed a person that meal, the beauty of the distinction was lost, right? I think that's part of what happens when you and I decide to be colorblind, is that in the process of us attempting to resolve the idea of being interconnected to one another, without losing our distinctions, or while without trying to create confusion, we end up losing the beauty of the different flavors that allow us to be who we are, right? And I say that specifically for Black consciousness because I think that when you say that, there is a lot of assumption. People assume certain things. There's an assumption that you are aggressive, you're angry, that you're ethnocentric, that the idea that you only affirm a conscience of all people. And so let me just give you a disclaimer before I get into the scope. I believe in the dignity of all people, no matter your race, creed, or religion, background, social class, that everybody has a worth that's given from God. Everyone is filled with flaws. Everyone deserves dignity, honor, and love. And all people have been created by one creator, and have their own purposes in unique ways, but also collectively to care for what's been given to us, all right? So let me just say that, and because I think that sometimes as you talk about different things, people assume automatically that you affirm one thing. That's why even the idea of Black Lives Matter became such a controversial phrase, because a lot of us assume because saying Black Lives Matter, it meant that no one else mattered, right? And that's by no means what I'm saying, right? If you're just joining us, you may want to add some people, invite some people to this scope. I'm going to talk about history right now, because I think that without history, you don't have a context to the idea of evangelicalism, Egyptology, and why this all matters to you, right? So growing up in school, I went to public school in Dallas, and I went through the Texas literature, right? I don't know if you're from Texas, but Texas indoctrinates you with every single thing about Texas, right? So we grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance to Texas. I grew up knowing all the flowers, the birds, Texas history. What up, NYC? What up? I knew all those different things growing up because they make sure that they indoctrinate you with the idea of what Texas is, right? Here's what I realized growing up. that history class, given the historical bias and the things that they were trying to infuse into our psyche, our understanding of the world, was limited. It was not complete. It was not comprehensive, and oftentimes told stories only from the vantage point of the North American, only from the vantage point of the middle class, only from the vantage point of Europeans. And so when you get into the larger global system of the world, you begin to realize, wait, there's other narratives. There are narratives working in conjunction with the narrative that you see being on display in a history book, right? And here's why that's problematic. Because what it does is, it now, the onus of power, the onus of perspective is now placed on the person with the mightiest hand with the pen. The person who can publicate their thoughts. The person who can refine or even revise history in such a way that it plays to whatever narrative is being communicated, right? And so I'm saying this all on the front end because I know many of us have a gross understanding of history. I'll tell you what we learned, if you're North American, right? We learned about the Civil War. We've learned about the American Revolution. We've learned about World War I, World War II. We've learned about the Great Depression. We've learned briefly about civil rights. And we've learned about the Bay of Pigs and just different, little skirmishes and different things that ultimately created what we know as America today, right? But the problem is there's so many running narratives that it doesn't give the beauty of what the holistic American narrative is, right? And so let me talk to you a little bit about the African narrative, right? Because I think that a lot of times the African American narrative gets lost because it's been reduced to three things. You can kind of take notes. You might want to take notes on this. So I'm a teacher, I kind of think in these terms, right? It's been reduced to three things. One, it's been reduced to slavery, okay? It's been reduced to civil rights. And lastly, it's been reduced to a narrative of poverty and criminality, right? So when you think about African Americans living in North America, the scope of everything that you see revolves around slavery, civil rights, and poverty and criminality, right? Now, here's the problem with that. The problem with the idea that the narrative of an entire people group revolves around that is, it doesn't give honor to the people who are not impoverished, who were never slaves, who are not criminals, who are actually brilliant thinkers and inventors and beautiful cultures and communities, and who were world and global travelers, and who were innovative and artistic and created all those different things, right? It doesn't give credence and dignity and honor to that narrative, right? Because you end up missing it. So let me give you a couple of things that happened for, right? Again, I have to give you history before I make my point. I'm going to make a point about evangelicalism, Egyptology, and why it matters to you. But if you don't realize, and I don't recognize, we've been miseducated historically. That miseducation keeps us from seeing one another in a very healthy, balanced way, or the accurate depiction of who we are, given the real events, the real occurrences that have taken place, right? So again, invite followers, invite people you know. I'm BJ Thompson, and I'm diving into the idea of Egyptology, evangelicalism, why it matters to us, and it's a discussion on faith and Black consciousness, right? So here's the thing, just a little history, and I know this is boring because we've been taught to think history is boring, but history isn't boring, it's context, right? You can't address issues, and that's part of our issue, right? Part of our issue is we want to deal with the results of something, but we don't want to look at the history that created the outcomes that, allowed us to see the results, right? So here's the first thing. The first thing is this. is that an entire group of people were stripped from their native land in order to create new established places of trade and commerce for Europeans, right? And I think this is very important, right? We downplay the idea of people being stripped from their land, bought, going through the Middle Passage and all these different things, being put on boat in subhuman conditions, people committing suicide, people being sexually violated, all different things being made forever indebted and enslaved to people based off of the color of their skin, right? Now, again, we say that's a long time ago that happened, but that happened globally. That wasn't just North America. That happened in Brazil. That happened in Dominica. That happened in Jamaica. It happened all over the world, where now you have a group of people from a continent and they're being snatched from that continent and they're being taken to all different places to work as free labor for people of European descent, okay? So that's the first thing, okay? And again, I'm only saying it for historical context. Again, I understand some of us are easily guilty. Some of us easily walk out of this conversation because it is extremely difficult to come to grips with the reality of what takes place. But if you tap out every time the conversation comes up, you will not be able to confront some of the things that we're enduring right now, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. Once the African was brought to the land, okay, he or she was brought to the land with zero connection to their native land, all right? They didn't speak the language here. They were now indebted for life and generationally, and they were taught nothing about it. Once the first generation of people died off, right, the second generation found themselves being established in a land with no connection of the native land, the native tongue, their customs, of any of those different things, right? And again, let me tell you why that's important. It's important because of this. You can't establish a people. You can't be a healthy person and not know where you come from. I'll give you a quick example. A quick example to me is adopted children, right? Shout out to all my friends who are adopted. I have a lot of friends that are adopted, right? And it is a beautiful thing to be adopted. You know, it's a God-given grace to be adopted. But if you're an adopted child and you find out one day that the people that you call mom and dad aren't biologically your mother and your father, it sends your mind into a panic, right? Because we are made to have natural biological connections to our maternal and fatherly figures that allows us to establish ourselves in a new world, right? When you don't have that connection, it sends you, or it creates in you, what's called a trauma. There's a trauma because there's an absence of history. Now you don't know who you are. You don't know where you came from. You don't know who you belong to, who loves you, who doesn't love you. Now you found yourself scouring in a place where nothing makes sense, right? Let me tell you how that relates to the African. How that relates to the African American is when they were brought to the land, and all of their history was erased. There was no more history. There was no more, these are your customs, this is your tribe, this is your language, this is your dance, this is your family history. Now you are property to a person, a human being, and you no longer even have your last name. So I said this yesterday, but I think it's a very powerful point. African Americans, out of everybody in the globe, share what I called a shared narrative of suffering and oppression. And I'll tell you why. An identity crisis, right? So my last name is Thompson. My father, Joe Thompson, Ronald Joe Thompson. If you go back, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, right? Where did the name Thompson come from? From the slave master. It came from the people who own my family. Master Thompson, right? And I think that's very important, because when you deprive a people of a history, of even their very native name, now they find themselves as orphans in a new land, right? And this is very important. This is very, very, very important, right? Because again, we're so ignorant of history, and we're so quick to say that was the past, move on, it doesn't matter. Well, now, on top of feeling and being a genuine orphan to a land that's been established by your people who actually helped build the nation, right? Now you're being told, hey, you know what? Your only narrative is slavery. Your only narrative is civil rights, having to sit at the back of a building, right? Not having equal rights. Your only narrative is criminality. And your only narrative is suffering and oppression, right? Now you take all those different things and you begin to compound them on a person. What does it cause? It calls for suspicion. It calls for oppression. It calls for identity crisis. It calls for confusion. It calls for all types of things of ongoing trauma for one group of people based off of what? The color of their skin. Just because my skin color is brown, all of a sudden, the oppression that I endure is only based off of the fact that I'm a brown-skinned human being, right? Invite your followers to this, all right? If y'all want to hear some real talk about history, about evangelicalism, Egyptology, what that means, what we should think about it, right? And again, I have to give you some historical context, because oftentimes we just say things and we don't really get what it is that we're saying. We have no sense of history. Now we find ourselves in a situation where we are just kind of talking, right? And I'm not just talking. I'm talking to you, as a brother who's very concerned about what's taking place, all right? So again, invite your followers, invite people, all right? Here's another thing, okay? So let's just compound all that problem. Let's talk about the history of what it is, the fact, the reality that we are lost. We are global orphans. Black Americans are global orphans. They don't have a narrative. They are disenfranchised. They find themselves at the butt end of systems that have been created to discriminate against them based off of the color. Now think about this. The color of their skin allows them to be in a certain people class and has created for them an indebtedness and a criminality and all types of things, right? And again, I'm just talking to you from history. If you can't handle that, I don't know what to tell you, because that's not the narrative that I created, nor is it the one that I desire, right? That's just a historical narrative. Because of all those different things, now you have a community of people who find themselves in a place where they're trying to figure out life with zero history. So what do they have? They have the present. That's all they have is the present. And here's what happened in the 60s, and then I'm going to get to my first point. The 60s showed people that in their present, they did not have a place of equality and value, right? The 60s said that the moment you attempt to assert your rights in a way that are equal and consistent with the rights of white men and women, that now you will be thrown into jail, you will be hung by the Ku Klux Klan, you will be persecuted by your neighbors, you will be targeted by individuals. This is what happened in the 60s. I'm just giving you history. That's all I'm giving you is history. I'm not giving you anything else, right? And here's what happened. It sent people, good people, into a place of tailspin. Because now their normal life of being in society, feeling valued, having a place, knowing where they belong, being a part of a faith community was now being called into question, because the moment they wanted equal rights, not superior rights, they were now being challenged by the state itself, right? Now, here's the issue with that. what happened is something very intentional, and something that I don't think any of us saw coming. What happened was people began to now, like an orphan, ask, what are my origins? Where did I come from? Who am I? What does this mean? And there were people who came up and said, here's who you are. You are a nationalist. You are a Black Panther. You are a Nation of Islam. You are an individual that has value that goes back to Mesopotamia and these different arenas in Africa, right? Now let me get into the evangelical talk of this, all right? During that time, evangelicals, given their close connection to the state, given their close connection to the idea of being American, oftentimes were silent, right? And many couldn't raise their voice to say there's something wrong with this. And I'll tell you why that's problematic. It's problematic because the evangelical is what's called a Christian. A Christian is somebody who is connected to Christ. Christ has a different type of kingdom. His kingdom, his place, his relationship, the way he establishes structure and culture, doesn't take partial views based off of race, social class, background. Jesus doesn't do that. So the problem with the evangelical stance of silence or even division or frustration all were problematic to the very worldview that they were affirming at the same time. And you see examples like this from Martin Luther King. When he's in Birmingham and he's been in prison for peaceful protest, and they are accusing him of being divisive, and he pens what's called, and you can look this up, a letter from a Birmingham jail where he calls out Southern Baptists. Now, they have since repented and recanted from those things, but he calls them out for accusing him for being divisive, for wanting to see equality and justice for African Americans who were not receiving that, right? So again, history. I have to give you history because it doesn't make sense. All that to say is this. The evangelicals sitting back silent, all it did was fuel people's disgruntledness and frustrations with Christianity. At that point, Christianity didn't make any sense. It made little to no sense to be a Christian because being a Christian meant that you had to deny the very real suffering and disenfranchisement of your own people, right? And so what happened, honestly, was things like the Nation of Islam, where the Nation of Islam brought up a viable opportunity and a viable option of spirituality that affirmed the Black identity, that affirmed the way that people had suffered, that affirmed the real dignity and the hope that people had that was connected to Africa, that was connected to real life spirituality. So guess what happened? The people who began to affirm Black history, African dignity, real spirituality, or some sort of alternative begin to swell in numbers simply because of what? Because of the silence and the passivity of evangelicals, right? And here's the thing, is that the idea of you being silent in the 60s actually fueled a person like Muhammad Ali to become a Nation of Islam, right? And again, we have to begin to look at the scenario and say, wow, if a person is being told that within their own faith culture, they don't have dignity, worth, value, or acknowledgement, that they in themselves can't derive or receive that from the people who say they love them as brothers and sisters, and yet when the rubber meets the road and you have to make a practical application, then you no longer want to be with me, right? And that happened in the 60s. That was a big deal in the 60s, and you saw a lot of people jumping ship from Christianity. What's my point? 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we had the tragic loss of Trayvon Martin. And I think for a lot of us, it really created a lot of frustration. It created a lot of revisiting of what was forgotten, what we were told to forget, that the 60s were over, that we don't need to protest, we don't need to see color. And I think that it really created in a lot of us a reignited reminder that there was something wrong with the American system, right? And again, it was that incident. And then last year, last August to be precise, that was the death and the loss of Michael Brown, which I think created just a lot of triggers. And it was just a very vivid reminder of the themes that had occurred, not just in this vacuum, but themes that have been occurred since NWA, when they were saying, you know, forget the police. And, you know, that's the G-rated version of that, right? Because when you look at the Rodney King riots and you saw people coming to head with the police, it was because they felt like no matter what I do, there's going to be injustice, and I can't fight the system. I'm going to fight the system. I have to fight the police, and I'm not able to receive the type of dignity, worth, and respect that allows me to be one person under God, indivisible, and what? Justice for all, right? And so I think what ended up happening, and so this is just me speaking out of love, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about these things, we talk about them out of anger, and we talk about them out of a very one-sided type of perspective. If you're with me, if you're just joining us, I am BJ Thompson. I am talking about faith, consciousness, in the state that we're in, and what do we need to do historically to rethink, revisit where we are, and also how do we begin to love our neighbors that are different from us, right? Invite your followers, you know, on whatever medium you got, because I want us to hear this. This is something I feel like we need to hear, and I'm only sharing it because it's becoming something that's growing, right? I need to give y'all this too. Like, as a leader, as a man, as somebody has a growing platform, like, I risk a lot by talking to you about this, because here's what happens. Like, you don't see prominent leaders giving you a lot of straightforward, honest talk about these issues, because they have books on the line. They want to be at the next conference. They're finding themselves in these situations where somebody is, you know, they want to bring them out, and they don't want to be depicted as the angry black man, right? And so I risk a lot by talking to you about this, but here's the thing. I honestly want to see transformation. And if that means that I don't get invited to a seminar or two, that's fine. I'm fine with that. More than anything, hey, how you doing? I want to see us come together in a meaningful way that really creates dignity, that doesn't deprive one another, and we're honest about what's happened, right? So again, let me get off of that. Here's what happened. After 2 years of waiting for a collective response of brothers and sisters standing up and saying, no, that's not okay. You can't choke out a man on camera over some cigarettes. No, that's not okay. You can't create a system that disenfranchises people based off of the color of their skin. No, that's not okay. You can't segregate people educationally and hinder them from having maturity because you're building a class system. Instead of the church saying, no, that's not okay, the church, the majority church, said this. We'll see what happens. And sat silently, right? I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you something very honestly, right? I have talked to black leaders all across this nation, and they pay attention to your silence. Like, if you don't believe that, there's something wrong with you. We pay attention to your silence. We recognize when silence is occurring because you're not certain, not just what are you going to say, but silence is saying, I'm not going to stand up for what's right. All right? And so let me tell you what it did. All right? I'm just going to tell you what it did. What it did was it created a very deep distrust from younger believers who were now saying, yo, I don't understand what this is. I don't get it. I don't understand why it is that I can be beat on and you don't say a word. You don't come to my rescue. You don't step up. You send out funny, weird tweets. The world keeps spinning as if nothing's happening, right? And I think what happened, and again, this is just me, this is not me personally speaking, this is me speaking the larger context. I think what happened, and there was a part of a lot of us, trust-wise, that died. Where the trust for a certain type of support, care, love left. Because what we realize is that when the rubber meets the road, you're more fearful of men than you are of God, right? And so here's what I'm saying, okay? That whole idea opened up, again, just like with Muhammad Ali, the room for who to come in? Cults to come in. Historical saviors to come in. To say, you have dignity, you have worth, you have history, you were a king, you were this, you were that. And if they won't speak up, we will, right? And so all of a sudden, the nation shows up again. All of a sudden, 5%ers show up again. All of a sudden, these cultish individuals show up again. And guess who created the room for them? Evangelicals. Evangelicals. We, as evangelicals, in silence, by your very silence, have created room for cultish, historical individuals to come in and say, if they won't help you, I will. If they won't speak up for you, I will. If they don't understand, then I do. And I am going to speak up in such a way that is dignifying, honoring, and bringing you back to your roots, right? Now here's the thing. Again, I'm not blaming you. I'm giving you the context for this conversation because it doesn't make sense for me to just say something and not give you the context, right? So here's the thing. One, silence hurts you. Silence hurts us because what it communicates to the person who's suffering is either you don't know or you don't care, right? And after about 2-3 years of very hard online in-person conversations with people, it's obvious that it's really hard. And it's obvious that silence is no longer an option for you, all right? And again, hear me say this. As a person in Christ, it's my job to stand up for what's right. I don't get to sit back, right? So I sat and wrestled with the idea of should I say something, should I not? Because everything in me just said, you know what? Man, it's too controversial. I don't want to be involved in it. I'm this, I am a growing figure, a voice. Man, I don't want to be involved in all different things. But you know what hit me is that means I'm fearing men. Like, that means I'm scared of you. And I'm not fearing God who can kill the body and then throw the soul into hell. I'm fearing men who can kill my body. And I find myself in a situation where now I can't speak out of conviction because I am fearful of what's going to happen to me, right? And so here's the thing. That silence spoke so deeply that now there are many, many of brothers and sisters who are now, they're not just reconsidering evangelicalism. There are people who are reconsidering Christianity, right? And that should grieve us. That should grieve us because guess what? We created the void in silence. by being silenced to the idea and the suffering of people. We, not you, we created the void. We caused them to despair. We caused them to second guess whether or not Jesus loved people who are oppressed and marginalized. We, not you, we created that void. And so now there is an entire group of people who are growing up and they're not sure if Jesus is the way, right? So again, this is the background of this conversation is evangelicals. Again, if you hear me, and I know a lot of you, I know a lot of people, if you hear me, we are the problem. And whether you know it or not, whether you fully understand the background of or not, Satan is stepping right up to the plate and saying, I'll take you. Oh, they don't want to take you? I'll take you. Oh, you want some history? I'll take you. I'll bring on some people into your life to help speak into the places where they won't speak up, right? And it's not biblical. And it's not consistent. And it's not gospel-centered, right? So again, we have created a void by being silent and assuming that people are just going to get over it and it's just going to be better if I don't say anything about it. Listen to me. You are not making it better by being silent. At best, ask questions. At best, do whatever you got to do. You better figure out whatever you got to do to start pursuing racial reconciliation, because I'm telling you, underneath the surface of what you see as calm is a brewing storm of distrust that's taking us right back to the growth of the Nation of Islam, the 5%ers, Hebrew Israelites, whatever those things are that bring dignity, honor, history, and spirituality to a people who do not feel like they're being connected to Christianity, right? So let me talk to you about one other thing. Again, somebody about to get blocked. Let me talk to you about one other thing, right? One thing that I think adds to this discussion. That's good. White Jesus, I'll talk about that. One thing that adds to this discussion is that the way we depict history, the way we depict Jesus, the way we depict situations, is that we do not include these individuals, these minorities into the larger narrative, right? And I'll tell you why that's problematic. Not only have we excluded people from history at large, from wars, revolutions, inventions, establishing land, developing property, all those different things, trade, ideas, everything, right? Not only have we excluded from there, but we have excluded them from theological history. That means that the Christianity that we're absorbing is so characterized by European males that it excludes any remnant of substantial contribution of God using anybody outside of a white man, right? Now again, that's not to be condescending. That's not me being inflammatory. That's not me being angry. I'm not even angry about it, because God has used tons of people across the board, no matter their color, no matter their race, white males specifically. He's used them, and praise God for that, right? But when they become the exclusive figure and picture of the faith and the contributions of what it means to be connected to the higher power, now what we're saying is this: the closest people to God are Anglo-Saxon. The closest people to God are Caucasian. The closest people to God are Europeans who speak on behalf of all the rest of the billions of people on the planet, right? And it's not consistent, nor is it biblical, nor is it honoring. And it actually takes away from, if you are a church person, if you're like a for real high conversation person, right? High doctrinal person. It takes away from the imago Dei. It takes away from the image of God being displayed in people, because it says that only certain people have the privilege of being used by God. And that's just not true, right? Let me run you through a few things, because again, I went through church history. I never forget sitting with my professor, and I went through, Bible college. And I went through, I just sat through, and I went through seminary, and I've learned all these different things. And I'll never forget going through my church history class, and I was asking my professor, I go, hey, why is it that there is not one single individual outside of European descent being communicated in church history? And you know what he told me? He said, well, BJ, if you want to learn that, you need to do a special study. And I go, why is it that every time I want to learn about the intertwining of God working through different nations, it has to be a separate study from what's being communicated, right? And so here's what I had to do. I had to go back and I had to learn. Let me give you a couple of things. Y'all ready? You might want to take some notes, okay? And again, this is just me tracing African heritage through the Bible and through church history. Okay, because what I think is we get robbed of an opportunity to be able to experience something in a meaningful way. I hope I'm doing well on time too, because I'm just like rolling with it right now. All right. So the first thing is this. The first thing you see, I'll talk about some resources and some books. First book is the Bible. That's a good book. Divided by Faith is another good book that I would tell you to pick up. And then there's a ton of other books that I pick up. So let me just give you some history, okay? Again, biblical history, Africans you see. You do not just see Europeans or any one race in the Bible. You see a array, because that's who God made. God made everybody, right? So let's start with history. First and foremost, we see in Genesis 2:13 through 15, it says this. The name of the second river is Gihon, the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows through east of Syria. And the fourth name of the river is Euphrates. The Lord God did what? Took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it, and he kept it, right? Here's what we learn. We learn that God put Adam by this river called the Euphrates and the Tigris, right? Which is connected to the Nile River. Guess where the Nile River is? Africa. The Nile River is in Africa. That means when God made the first two people, he dropped them off where? In Africa. All right? Second thing. All right? So you just believe it. I'm just giving you some things. All right? I'm not being ethnocentric. I'm just giving you, if you are wondering, where is the narrative? Why is it that we have no history? All of our history has been erased. Black African Americans have no history. Our history has been erased. And we're being told that we have no narrative that coincides with the Bible and with spirituality, right? Another thing, the lineage of David. The lineage of Jesus, tracing back to David, is connected to a couple of significant figures. And this is what took me so long. Bathsheba, Ruth, Tamar, and Rahab, right? And all of these women were substantial figures who were part of this line, this bloodline of David that allowed them to birth Jesus. We knew that there was one who was going to sit on David's throne, and that was Jesus himself. Now, here's the thing. They were all Hamitic. They was descendants of Ham, which is in the where? The Horn of Africa. That means Ruth, remember Ruth? Who in Jabez, right? You got Ruth, and you have Naomi, and you have Tamar, and then you have Rahab and the spies, and you have all these different individuals where they were all Africans. And we know the same is true even with Zipporah, right? Zipporah, it talks about how God gave some leprosy because they were speaking ill against the woman that Moses married, right? So we know that within the scope of creation, within the scope of being freed from Egypt, and even the lineage of Jesus, there's what? There's African people, right? And so here's the thing, again, and I'm not saying it's not just African people, but they're there. They're in the scripture, right? Here's another thing. Simon of Cyrene, the brother who carried Jesus' cross, right? Where's Cyrene? Africa, right? Cyrene is in Africa. That means an African man carried what? Jesus' cross, all right? Not only that, but when you look at the book of Acts, and when they're trying to decide whether or not, who's going to lead the Gentiles to provide substance for people, who do they pick? They pick Simon the Niger and Lucius of Cyrene. Where are they from? Africa. They're from Africa. These are Africans in what? In the Bible, in Judaism. They're embedded there. They're a part of Old Testament history and lineage. They're part of New Testament history. They're part of the church. They're part of the church and its development. They're part of all these different themes that are taking place. What do you see? Africans. They're deeply involved in the things of God. Not only that, I'll give you another thing. You have Acts 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch, right? And Philip. What happens? Here, this Ethiopian eunuch is sent from Candace the queen, and he is reading Isaiah, and what happens? God sends Philip to them, and all of a sudden, Philip begins to have this conversation, and he begins to go back to where? He goes back to Ethiopia. If you look at Ethiopia today, Ethiopia is a Christian nation. Why? Because before any colonization of Africa from any European, they were what? They were Christians. They were Christian. God was working with Africans. He's always done it. I'm not telling you anything new. I just want to make sure you understand that God has always biblically worked through Africans. He's always done it. Not only that, let's talk about church history. Maybe you've heard of a guy named Athanasius, and he was nicknamed the Black Dwarf. All right, I'll give you this. He was nicknamed the Black Dwarf because he was short and dark-skinned. He was exiled 5 times by 4 Roman emperors, spending 17 of the 45 years as he served as a bishop of Alexandria in exile. In the end, he won out because his writings shaped the theological vision of the church. Now, this is a very important key. You need to know who this individual is, right? You need to know who Athanasius is. He defended and refined the Trinitarian thought, right? He was a black man. He was involved in all these councils of thoughts after the apostles died. And they were trying to figure out what it was, what it is, and what it's not. And here's what it says. Specifically, he wrote this in a council. They had a conversation about whether or not Jesus was God. And one cat said Jesus was not God because he couldn't be God. God couldn't exist in 3 forms. This is what he said. If the Father begat the Son, then he who was begotten had beginning in the existence. And from this, it follows that there was a time when the Son was not, right? Athanasius said the Son of God, Jesus, was eternal, and he was of the same stuff that God the Father was. Now listen to this. I'm going to break it down for you, okay? They were having a large discussion as to whether or not, and this is, if you're not a Christian, this is the very foundational thought of Christianity, right? Christianity doesn't just hinge, it hinges on the idea that Jesus came and he died, came a baby, grew up to be a man, and he gave his life for other people, right? It also hinges on the idea that that baby had something different than me and you, right? I was a baby once. You were a baby. We all were babies at some point. Athenaeus, a black man, argued that Jesus wasn't just a regular person, that he indeed had always existed. Now listen to this. Had he not argued this, the black dwarf, dark-skinned guy who was exiled 17 of his 45 years as bishop, you would be extremely confused and conflicted on the idea of the Trinity, right? That's a brother who saved a lot, all right? So again, here is an African, and if you go back and look at the pictures of him, and this is what's saddening, they depict him as a white man in some portraits. Why? Because we just can't come to grips with the idea that God is not a respecter of persons. God is not a respecter of colors. God is not a respecter of ethnicities. God will use whoever he wants to use, and he does not respect the idea of a skin tone. He'll use an African, he'll use an Indian, he'll use a European, he'll use an Asian, because guess what? He is God and God alone. He don't need your help. He don't need your preferences. He doesn't need your racism. He's God and God alone. All right? So he used an African man to preserve and the idea of the Trinity, that he is God and he don't need your help. The other thing is this. That was Athenaeus. There's another person named St. Augustine of Hippo. And St. Augustine developed the Christian principles of this. Now, you're going to be blown away. If you're a church history person, this should blow you away. All right? Church history people. Augustine developed the Christian principles of original sin. Original sin, right? Divine grace, predestination. Guess where Augustine was from? You would not believe it. Where's Augustine from? Africa. He was African. Here is the person that influenced the 5 solas. Sola Gloria, Sola Scriptura, right? Sola Biblica, Sola Gracias, right? I think it's Sola Doctrine. I forget the last one, right? Here is the person who influenced predestination, who influenced original sin. St. Augustine, where did he come from? He was African. Wait, time out. You mean to tell me the person who helped originate these ideas of what oftentimes many of us evangelicals dispute, debate, argue over, create denominations over, find pride in, all of a sudden he's African? Absolutely. Augustine was African. He was African. So if you have a problem with the idea of God using Africans, you gotta, there's a lot of stuff you have to erase, right? He influenced Martin Luther. He influenced John Calvin. He influenced all these individuals, right? Last thing, let me give you this. Y'all know I love y'all, all right? Not only was the Reformation influenced by Africans, the whole Reformation, all of that, right? And so let me just give you this disclaimer. God uses people. Man, God used Martin Luther. Praise God for that. Praise that he used Zwingli and he used these individuals. But our problem is that we leave out Africans and other ethnicities from this larger conversation on church history. And because of it, we leave people thinking that what's right? White is right. Like we might as well say it. We may as well say that the only people that God, our God, who's not a respecter of person, the only person he wants to use is a white man. All right? And I'm just going to tell you from church history or for whatever that is, it's just not true. All your major thoughts of doctrine theology came from Africans. All right? So let's talk about North America, because again, we've been given this heritage of suffering and shared pain and slavery and whatever. Now think about this. North America will have some very interesting individuals. One, we have Richard Allen. All right. If you're not familiar with Richard Allen, get familiar. Richard Allen was born a slave. Richard Allen was born in the 1700s, and Richard Allen essentially engineered the idea of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? AME Church was connected to the Anglican Church. Let me give you another little history, just a little bit. I'm trying to go because I want to make sure I get into Egyptology, because I want to wreck their world real quick. AME, the reason why the AME Church started was Rich Allen in the 1700s was trying to worship, and as they were trying to worship, they come to worship and they would be in prayer and they would be in worship. And when one of our white brothers and sisters would walk up behind them and they would pull them off their feet. And they go, wait, I'm in worship. What do you mean I can't worship? They were freed men, and now they were in a situation where they were now having to fight to be in a place of worship, right? Now, here's the problem with it. They ended up starting what's called the AME Church because they could not get the dignity, honor, and the respect that God was calling people to abide by the scriptures, right? And so here's the thing. Rich Allen was one of the largest African Americans missionaries that America has known, right? He's an amazing guy. Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church. You don't believe me? Go back and do a search. Not only that, but we have a guy named Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, also born a slave, born in the 1800s, 1818 to be precise. And he was a social reformer, an abolition orator, a statesman, right? He was born a slave, and he was a very public, vocal voice on what the Imago Dei meant, why Jesus' death and resurrection should be freeing slaves, where they shouldn't be slaves anymore. And he was very vocal about the idea of God loving all people and wanting equality for all people, right? Frederick Douglass, one of the voices, and what was he driven by? Christianity. He was driven by Christianity because he knew that God wanted that, not just because men wanted it. When men didn't want it, Frederick Douglass knew God wanted that, right? And the last person I'll go, and there's tons of people, just hear me just saying this, and I got to finish my point because I might be close out of time. Tom Skinner, right? If you are not familiar with Tom Skinner was an evangelist whose height was in the 1960s and 70s, and he spoke as a prophet among civil unrest, racial injustice, civil rights reform. And he spoke as a Christian who was both authentically Christian, but then also authentically black, right? And he spoke in such a way that he created these large revivals. And many of the leaders that you know today were either discipled or directly influenced by Tom Skinner. Look him up. Tom, T-O-M, Skinner, right? Here's my whole point in all this. If you are an African American, or if you're just a person just viewing this scope, African Americans have such a rich history to this nation. We are not orphans. We stand on the legacy of not just these activists in the civil rights. We stand on the legacy of abolitionists. We stand on the legacy of church history men. We stand on the legacy of people who carry Jesus' cross. We stand on the legacy of individuals who found themselves in the lineage of Jesus, who were faithful to him. Here's what the point is. We're no longer orphans. We are not orphans in this world. We have a place. We have a history. And it's not just in slavery. It's not just in civil rights. It's not just in criminality. We have a place. And it's not given by a white man's Christianity. It's given by who? The God himself. The divine being himself. We have a place. And I need you to hear that. Because these cults are rising up and they're telling you that you have a place somewhere else. No, you have a place in church history. And you have a place among people who have been faithful through centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries at a time. Right? And for those of you who may not be African American, let's say you're just watching this and you're going, what about me? What does this mean for me? Here's what it means for you. It means you get to be informed, maybe in a way that maybe you didn't know before. Maybe you didn't realize that there was such a rich history outside of oppression, a rich history outside of slavery, a rich history outside of this narrative of criminality for black culture that has existed and has always existed apart from any form of colonization to take place any form of the globe. All right? And so again, hopefully this is something for you to celebrate. Hopefully this is something for you to get excited about. Hopefully this is something for you to be inspired by. That God has a global narrative that legitimately, and even sometimes to your lack of knowledge, includes people of Asian descent, Indian descent, African descent, all these different descents of people. God has a people, right? So again, the first thing that we need to know in all of this is that you have a place, that historically, spiritually, you have a place, and you don't have to be swept up by these historical cults speaking into the idea that you don't have a place, because we have, as evangelicals, dropped the ball and we don't know how to dignify the struggle, right? So the last thing I would say in this one arena is this. If you are evangelical and you are of the majority culture, let me tell you what the best thing you can do. One, you can study for yourself, right? I think sometimes we live in the ignorance. We like being ignorant. We like saying we just don't know, right? And it actually hurts us, because when we enter the dialogue, we enter into a dialogue as a person that knows nothing, and we put the onus to know on the person that we're communicating with. And I'm saying, you can Google. Yeah, I mean, we are no longer at an excuse for a lack of information, right? Second thing is this. As we learn these things, and I haven't even touched on systemic oppression and how racism has made his way into systems, right? We can begin to honor one another and fight to build cross-cultural relationships that reflect dignity, equality, and unity for one another, right? That's what God wants from us. He doesn't want this shattered group of people who are all, fighting for their own. He wants a loving group of people who are humbled in the same regard and recognize that there's unity and there's peace and there's love at the cross. And that's what happens, is that we have a position and we have a place. And honestly, what you can say instead of making excuses and arguing is saying, I'm sorry. I love you. Help me understand. I'm sorry. I don't want to fight. Help me be your brother and your sister in a way that recognizes that we are brothers and sisters. All right? And I fear that I'm running out of time. Here's the last thing I'll say. So I got a funny email about, a comment about Egyptology and just what it is, right? And hopefully that you've heard enough historical connection to where you recognize that Christianity is not a white man's religion. If you are watching this scope and you believe that lie, you have not seen the historical Jesus. Christianity is a conglomerate of many narratives from many nations of God using different types of people to do what? To birth the Christ and to bring about his kingdom. There is not a European narrative dominating this. Now, there's an interwoven narrative of Europeans in it, but this is the conglomerate of all types of peoples. So if you heard me say nothing else, know that God has a variety of people that he's using, right? Last thing. For those of us who are struggling with some of these ideas, and again, invite your followers. I hope it's not too much for you. I want to share honestly and transparently. Again, I risk a lot. I'm sharing this with you, with my platform or whatever else that's on the line. But you know what? I'd rather see people be whole, be healthy, be healed, and be loved and be connected than I would be able to speak at the next conference. All right? The last thing I would say this. For those of you wrestling with the idea of becoming Egyptologists, let me tell you what Egyptology is, or whatever those things may be. Egyptology was started by a guy named Malachi Zuyark. Malachi Zuyark, I think, was kind of post-Christian, and he is debunked the idea of what it means to be a Christian, given the real oppression and the real neglect of history that has occurred for centuries at a time, right? And so for those of my friends who are struggling with the idea of black consciousness and black identity and what that means and what that doesn't mean, I get it. Like, it's real. It's not a fake thing, and we have been legitimately deprived of what it means to be black and have a historical connection, right? But here's what I would challenge you on. The idea that you will now find a sense of spirituality outside of it. Now listen to this point. A comprehensive understanding of thought that allows people, and this is what the Bible is, talks about God, talks about evil and where the evil come from, talks about flawed people and how he works through them, talks about the afterlife and what happens the moment the soul leaves the body and how that all works itself together. There is no other comprehensive book that does that by being honest about the characters and their very flaws, right? So for those of you struggling with the idea of going and becoming whatever that may be, in Egypt, in Hebrew, whatever that may be, here's what I would say. They're offering you a sense of like real history, right? But they're not offering you a comprehensive view of there were a couple things. Where did evil come from? How did we get here? What happens when you die? And what does it look like to resolve this broken picture of people in a way that makes sense, not just for Africans and African Americans, but the entire globe, right? And they can't offer you that, right? And it's because it's the result of people who are wrestling with real neglect. So here's what I would say. For those of you who are wrestling with being Egyptologists, maybe you got a friend that's Egyptologist and they're always talking about knowledge and they're always kicking facts and they're always talking about these different things. Here's the reality. The reality is some of those things are true. Timbuktu, all these different places, they're true. It's true. It's a true place. There's true things that happens. But here's the problem. It can't speak to you comprehensively because here's what it's doing. It's piecing together all these different thoughts from Egypt, from astronomy to astrology to epistemology to all these different things. So guess what? There's no comprehensive truth to it. You're just on a journey of knowledge. And you find yourself in a situation where you're just going on knowledge. You get your knowledge up, get your knowledge up. And here's the problem. And I'll leave you with this. You know the greatest force in the universe? What's the greatest force in the universe? Is it knowledge? No, it's not knowledge. The greatest force in the universe isn't knowledge. What's the force that will cause you to give your life for your child? No matter how young. It's love. It's love. The problem that you have when you build your new worldview of these shattered ideas of things, it can't deal with the problem of evil especially not the problem of evil inside of you. It may deal with the problem of evil inside of other people and ethnic groups, but it can't deal with your real consciousness of evil, right? Well, guess what Jesus does? Jesus says, I see your evil and I'm going to die for you, right? It can't deal with the idea of you transitioning, because once you leave from this body, you're going to transition. And not just you transition, but all humanity is going to transition out of their bodies. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, I'm going to carry you to the Father. You don't have to fix yourself. You don't have to make it right, right? Guess what? Knowledge can't do that for you. You can still be knowledgeable. You can have knowledge and not be lost and still be lost, right? And so here's what I would encourage you. If you want to study, learn history, learn heritage, do it. Do it. And listen, I get it. Christianity has been abused to enslave people. I get it. I mean, I totally get it. But listen, there is a rich faith that comes by knowing Jesus, rediscovering him, and then learning how to not just be ethnocentric, but a love that be able to transcend or to go beyond your blackness into Asian, Indian, African, Norwegian, all these different regions. The only person that can do that is Jesus. He's the only person that can do that. So, I love you guys. This has been good. If it's been good for you, share the scope. Hit me up. buildabetterus.com, BJ. I think I'm going to drop the relationship periscope. I don't know. I'm wrestling. Should I drop a relationship periscope tonight? But yeah, hit me up. All right. Love y'all. A lot of facts, a lot of history. Share this with all your friends. All right. Peace.